I'm going to go through a couple of demos and a few slides of single-page applications. But what are single-page applications? Basically, in a nutshell, it's the most basic form of application or single application or SPAs that a website basically controls what you see and what you can do from within the browser, or basically, realistically, from within the code behind. And the code behind is what gets executed in response to events that are triggered by the HTML rendering page. So, for example, clicking a button and navigating around the page. Normally what would happen, unlike in a traditional website, that navigation, the browser controls that and posts it back to your web server. Your web server does something about it, renders some more HTML, and sends it back. I'm just going to say SPAs. Single-page applications, or SPAs for the rest of the day, they render the output from within. There's no postbacks to the server. In fact, the page never reloads, okay? All the rendering, all the logic, everything to do about the application is all contained within whatever is loaded when you load that page. And generally, that's the HTML, style sheets, and JavaScript pages. And it's the JavaScript pages that handle all the routing that would normally be done by the browser. You handle all of that. One of the main design goals of SPAs is to provide the user with a more desktop-like experience. So you get immediate responses to the clicks and the events and the navigations around the page, instead of waiting for large page reloads from the server when you've posted back to the server. On the initial load of the page, the HTML will be loaded, the cascading style sheets will be loaded for the presentation rules, and the JavaScript logic will all be loaded into the browser. Now, there are certainly some pros and some cons associated with SPAs, and depending on what you're trying to do, you may have to consider some of them as a pro or as a con. For example, the back button. On a traditional website, the back button will take you back to a previous state. But in an SPA, you're taken back to where you came from completely. So before the page was loaded, not a different state of the page you're on or the application that you're in. So that means you have to provide additional ways of navigating back through your application. For example, if they've got a list up and they click an item on a list and it takes them to a view of that item on the list, clicking the back button will take them away from the page, not back to the list. So you'll have to control that navigation back to the list. This could result in losing data that's input by the user, and you may need to consider ways of avoiding that and catching it. And we'll see some of those throughout the morning. Generally, browsers remember scroll positions where the pages you've visited, so when you go back, it'll remember where you are. SPAs don't navigate in the same way, in that traditional sense. So your application may need to understand and store scroll positions of where they are in a particular bit of the application as they're navigating through lists, etc. Loading requires style sheets and JavaScript up front could slow things down a little bit, and you may need to consider that and how you deploy your various pages and files associated with them. Analytics. Basically, by default, analytics track page views. SPAs are not really pages. Once you get into it, navigating around the application will not fire, as I say, postbacks to the server, so your analytics will not be tracked. So you may have to consider that. But if you've got an application and you know the customer, the user that's coming in, and they're going to stay within the application, do you really need the analytics associated with what they're doing and when they're doing within that application? So in this session, we're going to look through some of these pros, cons, and some of the considerations. But we're not going to write the rule book of SPAs today. Far from it. For me, the best way to show SPAs is what I've been playing with. And the first thing I played with was something we did at a hackathon. Basically, earlier this year, Synergex hosted a hackathon, and Jacqueline, who discussed it in her education in the workplace session yesterday. I'm remote, I live in England, so it's quite difficult to be part of the hackathon in person, and I didn't get an invite to fly first class across for a couple of days. I was waiting for the invite, but it didn't happen. But I did join the support teams group to assist them with a great idea of creating an SQL connection string generator. You know, the SQL connection, you need a string to be able to talk to your database. And that string can be quite difficult to construct sometimes because you've got to remember all the things all the different options. Trouble is, being on the other side of the pond, as Synergex like to refer to me as, a pond dweller, what I did some background development for them while they slept in their beds soundly at night. The support team then went on and developed a simple C# class that accepted a number of parameters and generated the appropriate string. But while they were doing that, obviously in my little 2x2 square office, I considered the possibility of writing an SPA which would ask for the required data, process it using JavaScript, and generate the required SQL Connect string. And to be honest, it was the first real foray into SPAs and HTML and JavaScript that I'd ever done. I'd never actually written very much, in fact, not much at all, JavaScript before in my life. And I was surprised, really, just how easy it was to get things going. So, the SQL Connection String Generator was born. And for anybody who doesn't know, the SQL Connection API is a set of database routines that allow you to manage data in a relational database from Synergy applications. Simple as that. The connection string contains information that you need to access the relational database, where it is, who you're logging in as, what sort of database it is. So fields like username and password are usually needed. They don't all need them, but most of the databases need a username and password to identify and authorize the user so they can connect into that relational database. You have a driver. The driver determines the type of database. So the drivers all start with VTX, and then they're given basically a number. 0 is Oracle, 12 for Microsoft SQL Server, for example. You can connect to a local database directly, or you can connect to a remote database using SQL OpenNet. SQL OpenNet is provided by Synergex. And the syntax of the connect string is slightly different if you're using SQL OpenNet to talk to a remote database or a local database. And then depending on the database being used, there are different elements of information that are required to make a successful connection. Some databases, as I say, require username and password, others don't. But you define all of the information on the connect string and then say, connect to my database. Some of the databases like PostgreSQL and Sybase may require additional assistance from the Synergex Professional Services team if you want to get that configured and working. So that's what it looks like. Here's an example of our first single-page application, which is our SQL connection string generator. You can see the expected connection string at the top. Currently it's set to VTX 10, and that's because in the drop-down combo box we've got Oracle selected. Oracle requires a username and a password, so these entries or elements are available, and you can enter data into them. A remote database connection checkbox, if checked, provides additional server information. And as you'll see in the demo, as changes are made, the connection string is automatically and real-time refreshed to reflect what changes and additions you've made to the data. As I say, it's a single-page application, and basically your website would comprise of 3 files. The first file that the browser loads is the HTML. We've called ours default.html, so you don't actually have to specify it on the URL. And then this determines what style sheets and what code behind JavaScript files are loaded. The HTML defines the UI elements, i.e. the fields and the buttons that are on the page, but it shouldn't define how they look. That's up to the style sheet to do that. This is just a quick section of code from the default HTML page. We have a label called connection string and a second label with no content. The second label has an ID, in this case labeled connect string. This ID allows us to manipulate this control from our JavaScript page logic. If you've done WPF work where you've got a view and you've got names, named controls, or you've got controls on the view and you've got a view model and you basically bind them together, this is sort of the similar concept where you're binding data between the HTML and your JavaScript using these IDs. Another couple of interesting elements. The button has a caption of copy. And depending on the type of browser you're using, hopefully you'll be able to copy the generated connect string into clipboard and then go to Visual Studio and paste it into your, this is where I'm editing my Synergy code. Now the button is a type of button, as you would expect, but it sounds strange that you're defining a button with a type of button. The default behavior for a button on a HTML page is to submit the page back to the server. But this is a single-page application, so we don't want to go back to the server. We want to avoid that. So we define it as a button, and that means we can register and catch the events when you click and do things with that button inside our code behind JavaScript. So our self-contained single-page application remains a single-page application. We're not going back to the server. Remaining labels give us a way to provide feedback to the user. The label copy notification will display, just for a short while, we've got a little timer on there that makes it disappear, a message saying that you've put the connection string into the paste buffer. There's another one that displays when you select a database that you need PSG professional services assistance with. So it's more than just give me some data and I'll construct a connect string. You can easily control what elements of the application or of the HTML are visible to the user at any time by making and labeling div sections. And I've called all mine div something, something, something. And as long as you do that, for example here we've got a div section called div database name. So we can use that ID, div database name, in our JavaScript. And in our JavaScript then, we can enable and disable that area on the page. We can hide it or reveal it. So we can configure how the user sees or what the user sees as we're going through the code. And notice the build connection string on key event. That's a function in our JavaScript code behind that will get fired when they are pressing characters into the text database name. So as that's changing, we'll be updating our connection string. So this is just a bit of the JavaScript that comes behind, our code behind. We've called it pagelogic.js, and that's what gets loaded by the HTML. And this is where we can control what you see and what the user is allowed to do input into, and what the connection string ultimately looks like. In the code behind, we can define a function called pageLoaded. This function can be bound then to the onload page event from the HTML. So when the HTML is loaded and rendered, we can run some JavaScript to disable fields, hide fields away, hide complete sections of the application until those are relevant for the user. So this is basically where we're defining our view. So again, if you've done WPF stuff over the years at the conferences, we talked about visual states. And you'd have a visual state that said, I can see the key information. You'd have a visual state that said, I can see the data information. Very much similar to toolkit processing years ago. We had a key set and a data set. It's the same sort of concept. We can hide and reveal elements as we require them using the div names and the actual IDs associated with the controls. So when the user selects a database, we need to change the view that's rendered by the HTML. All the elements of the view are defined by the HTML page. We don't define what things looks like as such, but from the JavaScript. So from the JavaScript, we simply need to say, you can see this or you can't see this. If it's relevant, you'll see it. If it's not relevant to the type of database you've selected, then you won't see it. And we can manipulate elements on the HTML page using the document.getElementById function. Remember, we name and identify each element on the HTML with an ID, and we can then reference them. I'd recommend naming conventions. It makes things a lot easier to follow. So for example, all the div sections, I start with an ID prefix of div. So if I want to hide a div section, I can use a style.display attribute and set it to none. If I want to see it, I set it to block. And we can make decisions, as you see in the code, based on the data entered, for example, which database is selected, and we can query the appropriate elements on the HTML page and get at the data that's in them, and then we can make decisions based on what they've entered. This is a snippet of the code required to construct the SQL connect string. We're grabbing the data from the username and the password field on the HTML form. When we set up the username and password internally, notice the code is constructing two passwords. One that will display on the screen, which doesn't contain a password, it contains asterisks for the number of characters you've entered into the password, and one that's in the JavaScript that holds the actual password. Because when we construct the connect string and you paste it into your paste buffer, you want to have the actual password, not a collection of asterisks. So now we can run the connection string generator, select the required database, and enter the additional information we see, and see what the connect string looks like. Okay, so I'm going to select SQL Server. I'm going to put a name of Richard. I'm going to put a password of you can't tell, because I'm not showing you what it is. I'm going to say that I've got a DSN. But if I change and said it wasn't DSN, it was DSN-less, changing the radio button changes what you physically see on the screen and what you can enter. And as you put information into here, and I'm not going to type it in, you can see the connect string up here starts to change. it's listening to what I'm saying. You go back to DSN and all that information goes away. It might be on a remote one. If I go remote, then the connection string always starts with net : So as I'm changing the user interface, the JavaScript is responding to the events. I'm not posting back to the server. The JavaScript is responding to the events, and it's updating the user interface. And I can put a server name in of 1.2.3.4 and a port number of 1234, and I can do that. Unfortunately, it says copy to clipboard not available in Microsoft Edge. Thanks for that. I couldn't figure out a way of doing it, I'll be honest. If you're using Chrome or Safari or something like that, it works, but I could not figure out, and I Googled my life away trying to figure out an easy way of getting clipboard support inside the JavaScript inside Microsoft Edge. Thanks, Microsoft. Obviously, I could have just run it in Chrome. I'll go SQL Server again. I'm not going to put lots of stuff in. And now it's in the clipboard, and if I bring up Notepad, in here, if I just do Control-V, that's what I entered. So it's gone into your paste buffer. So if it works through Chrome, thank you very much. It doesn't work through Edge. Okay, so that's the first SPA. Dead easy. You've seen all the code if you've doing the live feed, and it's cool. Remember, the three main elements of our single-page application allow us to structure and separate out the different elements of the application. HTML defines what you see and how the UI is rendered. The style sheet complements the HTML by providing visual framework to define how the different elements work. What does a button look like? What sort of bordering does your input controls have, and all that kind of stuff? Where should the elements be placed on the screen? The JavaScript is the logic where decisions are made. They've entered some information, you do make a decision on it, and you can display that different information on the screen. You can enable and disable elements of the page. So together, these three elements provide a really powerful framework for building, as I say, desktop-style applications for the browser without having to go back to the server all the time for what you want to be doing. But that example was a pretty simple example. But it is a great example of a single-page application, but obviously it is rather limited. There's no data behind the application, other than what the physical user enters. Obviously, we need to be able to interact with data. And usually, this is held in some sort of database on a remote server, the application that may be completely different from the website that the web page is being hosted from. And today, you've heard it many, many times, the de facto standard is to provide your data through a RESTful web service. And that is a server providing RESTful compliant access to your data. RESTful web services are built to work best on the web, and that's what they're there for. In the REST architecture, the data and functions available basically within your database are considered resources. These resources are accessed through URIs. There are a set of simple operators, or what we call verbs, that define what operations can be performed on your data. For example, a get operation or verb allows you to retrieve data from the server, but not anything else. You can't do a get and update something on the server. Get purely returns data. The get operation, as I say, can't and will not allow modifications to data in the database. Or if it did, it would be a very naughty thing. In a nutshell, the web service needs to conform to a few standards. For example, your file structure tables are represented as resources, and you can use verbs like get to access those resources. So you can get the information from a particular table because that is considered a resource. Options allow you to provide more granularity on how you access those resources. For example, filtering the results returned from the server. The web service should return the data in a self-descriptive message using standard protocols like XML, or more commonly these days, JSON. And as I said, JSON is usually the preferred format, but XML does work. Every interaction with a resource is stateless, which means each message has to be self-contained. You make a call, you tell it what you want, it brings it back, and that's the end of it. But this session is not about web services or the structure of RESTful communications and operations. Today we're just looking at how we can get at and use the data provided by the web server in our single-page applications. Today, the easiest and pretty standard way of accessing remote data behind a web server is to use jQuery. jQuery is a really lightweight, write less, do more. I like things like that. JavaScript library, and so it's perfectly placed for our JavaScript back-end single-page applications. The purpose of jQuery is basically to make it much easier for you to use JavaScript on your website. jQuery basically takes a lot of the common tasks required that would require many lines of JavaScript code to accomplish and wraps them up into a few little methods that you can call essentially a single line of code. The fact it spans about 20 lines is neither here nor there, but it is actually one line of code. jQuery also simplifies a lot of the complicated things from JavaScript like AJAX calls. AJAX, asynchronous JavaScript or XML, simply put, is a set of capabilities that basically allows the JavaScript code to interact with a remote web server. Now, if you listen to the acronym, which was asynchronous JavaScript and XML, that acronym would suggest that JavaScript is XML based. Yes, it is. But today, it also handles and uses JSON, and so is the native way to do things in JavaScript. Now, when you're using AJAX, there are a lot of settings that can be applied, and we're making calls to the remote web server. The URL is the address, as you can see on the screen, where the resource is going to be found. You define the type of request, whether you're getting at a resource or putting a resource. We're just going to be putting for the moment, or deleting a resource by using the method setting. Generally, the method will be set to a get. And the method has to be one of the primitive verbs that are supported, like get and put and post. If the AJAX call is the same as a previous call, some browsers, most browsers, will cache the data and actually won't make the call, because the browser will say, you've just made that call, I'm sure the data is going to be the same, therefore I'm not going to make that call again, I'm just going to take the data out to the cache. Chances are that's not what you want. So you can usually override that setting and say, no, ignore the cache. If I say go to the data, go to the server and get the data. If you wish to force cross-domain requests, we can set a value of cross-domain true. In a nutshell, this will allow your website to attempt to access data from a different web server. And I'll talk a bit more about calls and cross-domains in a few slides. If you're performing cross-domain requests, you will also need to configure XML HTTP request object, the XHR field, and set it with the with credentials field to a value of true. Now, this request will run asynchronously, and when it completes, you'll either get a success or you'll get a failure. And either the success function or the function associated with success will be executed, or the function associated with error executed. Now, note here, if your web server returns a meaningful HTTP code, status code, you can be able to report that. If your server's simply not there because it's gone down, it's been switched off, or you got the URL, you'll actually get blank information back. And that's just the way AJAX works. It's weird. So you need to be able to handle that. So even though you don't get any error code, you have had an error. Showed this a couple of years ago. This is the Synergy DBS Manager. Obviously, this is not a Java page. Some of you know this, and some of you even use this. It's a tool that allows you to query and manage data in your Synergy data files using simple SQL syntax. Data can be located locally behind a remote web server, and this, as I'm sure you can tell, is a desktop WPF, Windows Presentation Foundation application, and it's written obviously entirely in Synergy.net. To run it, you need to install the application on your desktop, configure a couple of things, configure your data source, and run it. Simple as that. What we want, though, is to basically build a browser-based version of Synergy DBS query tool. Now, this session is highlighting single-page applications, so it's going to be a single-page application. The data will be hosted on a remote server. Okay, that's good. And it's not the server that's hosting the single-page application. So this is where we'll encounter cross-domain issues, where you've got one server is your web server and another server is your data server. The first thing the application is going to need to know is where the data physically is. Where's the service, the RESTful service that is being hosted, that is providing access to your data? This means that once we've got that, we can query that server and find out what data we've got on there. That can be anywhere in the world. The connect and load table information button, that's going to run a function in our JavaScript code behind, and that is going to have logic in it that will communicate with our remote server and say, can you tell me what resources that you have that I can get access to, please? And ideally, that'll be tables or resources. Now, I said this session is all about the client and not about the server side, but we do need to understand the resources the server provides to us. I mentioned earlier that in the REST architecture, the data and functions available within your database are considered resources. So what resources does the server provide, and what does the URLs look like? The URL will be constructed, as you can see on the screen, using the web server address and any port number, followed by API, which basically says I'm doing a RESTful API, and then quite often a version number. It's pretty important to use version numbers because then you can make sure that your client is targeting the right version of API. If you've got version 1, 2, and 3, you don't want a client that is expecting to be talking to version 1 to be talking to version 3. It probably isn't going to work. So the version number is quite important. My server then, it provides a resource called SYSTABLES. SYSTABLES is just a resource, like your customers is just a resource. But SYSTABLES is a resource, and that, when I query it, tells the remote server to tell me what resources I've actually got available on that server. So obviously this can help my Synergy DBMS browser know what resources I can now browse data from. The server also supplies a resource called SysColumns. SysColumns allows us to retrieve the actual column information for a particular table or a particular resource on our web server. Which means that now in my application, as well as knowing what resources I've got, I know the structure of those resources. I know what fields they are, I know what types they are, etc. And I can use these URLs to query the web server and say, tell me everything there is to know, and tell me dynamically. The first step when we run our Synergy DBMS Browser single-page application is to enter the address. Once we've done that, we can click the Load the Tables, and then we'll get a combo box up, which will show what the tables are. These are the tables that are available from the server. And once we've selected one, you'll be able to see that it's got a selection of fields, so we can do an order by. We can enter a primary key if we just want to get at one record, or we can get at all the records. We can limit the number of records. If you've got a file that's got tens of thousands of records in, you might only want to bring the first 100 back, for example. You can filter them, so you can say just the ones that have a certain value in them. And you can specify which columns you want, because they may have hundreds of columns, but you only want one or two of the columns or the fields. And then we can load the data. Once we've loaded the data, it'll run the find server tables function, and that will go off and bring back the data we've asked for. Okay? So that's the information we get back that tells us what tables we've got. This is where we can process those tables and create the information in the drop-down combo box. And once we've done that, we can then say, query the database, and we'll see the tables, the information directly from the server. Here we're specifying fields, comma separated, so we're only bringing those particular fields back. And here we're doing filtering, so we're only bringing, in this example, suppliers with a postcode that has a value of n inside it. And you should be able, if you're doing the live feed, you should be able to run this yourself. So you can connect to the database to retrieve the table information. I've got groups, parts, and supplier. Change method response, I'll talk about that in a minute. So if I select suppliers, I can then do table load, and I'll just minimize the size of my screen a little bit. I can change that to groups and do table load, and I can change it to parts, and I can do table load, and I can say, for example, order it by, I shouldn't make the screen so small I can hardly see what I'm doing, the cost price in descending mode, reload it, and everything's now brought back from the server in the cost price descending mode, okay, or order. So that's the SDBMS browser. Again, you're interacting with a single page application, you're not posting back to the server, everything's in the JavaScript, and you're able to query your Synergy data. Cross-origin resource sharing. Basically, in a nutshell, if you have a web server hosting your single page application, and you have a web server or a server over here hosting your RESTful services, the browser will prevent, if you test stuff through things like Postman, everything will work, but it's the browser that prevents this server, or code loaded from this server, talking to data on this server. The browser prevents it. It's called cross-origin or cross-domain And that's what you're trying to do. You can get around this. You can't do anything in the browser to get around this. It's all in the server, and it's in this web server here, this web service. This has to provide the browser the sort of comfort zone that says, yes, I will accept you coming from this original web server, and I will allow you to talk to my data. And you have to allow it there for this browser. And all the browsers support this. You cannot get around it. I don't believe there's any plugins for any of the browsers that allow you to get this. So if you've got a web server up on Azure and you've got a Synergy database RESTful service on this machine over here, you will encounter issues. They're quite easy to set up. You basically define a few headers that say, yes, everything from that server is okay coming from here, and some pre-flight operations, because the browser will actually go to your server and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing. Are you okay with me doing it? And as long as you respond saying, yes, I'm okay with you doing that, then life will be good. So, single-page applications. We've seen the Connect String Generator. We've seen the Synergy DBMS Browser. The next thing then is a CRUD, a bit of CRUD for you. Create, read, update, delete. Very simple maintenance programs. RESTful services provide the way to get and delete and post and put data. So we should be able to handle those, and we should be able to query data, make changes, and post it back to the server. We'd also like to be able to do what our desktop applications do with drills and lookups and validation. And a lot of the validation logic will be in our repository, especially if you come from a toolkit environment, or if you've not, you can add that validation in to say a field's required. It has to be uppercase. It has to be between these values, things like that. Last year we presented, obviously this is not a single page application, this is from the Symfony Community Framework that we presented last year, and this is a very simple, pretty much code generated maintenance program. At the top you have a list of the records in the file, and as you move down them, the information is displayed at the bottom, and you can edit that in. You can go into edit mode and change it, you can delete it, you can create new ones, etc. So what we'd like to do is replicate that in a browser. So we'll create a single page application maintenance program. We'll present a list of records that are available in the file. We can limit those and do the paging associated with it. We can allow the selection of a list item. We can enable a deletion of a list item. If they select something, we'll allow them to modify it. And if they click the right button, we'll allow the ability to create. And in doing so, what we'll also do is incorporate repository validation that says if it's a required field, we'll indicate that on the screen. If it's a required field and they've not entered something, we'll not let them continue. If it's a range field, etc. If it's got a drill down, we'll allow them to do a drill down if it's defined in the repository. If they've got a change method in the repository, we'll assume that that change method logic exists behind our RESTful server, and we'll make a call back to validate using our existing Synergy change method code. So here's a part maintenance. You started with a list. The list is pageable, so we've limited it to 5. There may be hundreds and hundreds in the file, but we're limiting it to 5, and the arrow buttons at the bottom will allow you to go next page, back page, back page. The little cross button allows you to create a new one. The buttons at the left-hand side, the first button allows you to edit it, and the second button allows you to delete it. We have load items from, these are the functions in the JavaScript that allow you to get at the resources and page the various things that you want to be able to see. It's all done using this append string, and that basically builds up the resource, and you'll see that in a moment. So we've got a load items from server function. We're going to append things like the limit, so we only want to bring 5 at a time back. We may want to specify we just want to see some fields in the list. Obviously, all the fields will come back if we want to edit the form, but in the list, we only want to see certain fields. This will allow paging, so if we're hitting the next page, we want to do a start from beyond the bottom one in our previous list. And that builds up a URL that basically says, go off and find the parts, limit it to 5 records. I only want to see the ID and description fields, and I want to filter it with anything greater than that particular part code. Okay? So that's how we'll do the next page and the next page URL. So building the results, we get a JSON string back. We're going to build a table. We're going to iterate through what we've been returned back and create columns and rows inside the table, as the code you can see here. We add edit buttons so we can actually edit and delete things. and then we put it into a named div section in the HTML. Okay, so we're rendering from the JavaScript, we're building up a table, and then we're rendering it on the HTML. Modifying data, if we select something, we should be able to modify it. We've got the red asterisks on there, so you can see that those are required fields. We've disabled the key field if you're in modify mode, just like in the old toolkit days where you've got set processing. You don't allow them into the key field if they're on modify mode. If they make changes and hit cancel, you'll get a dialog up that says you really want to throw everything away. So that's going to handle our sort of back button type processing. The HTML code that you'll see and be able to run in a minute if you're following the live feed is all code generated. Almost everything that you'll be running is code generated using CodeGen and the information from the repository. So we can build up the fields. If you look at the part one of the fields is about this big, and that's because it's code generated. We'd have to tweak something and make it a bit nicer to reduce the size of it, but it still works. We can sort out field focus and putting information from the repository, which we would see in the toolkit information bar, into various elements on the page as we're navigating through the fields. We can do validation in the JavaScript based on the rules inside the repository. We can execute a change method on the remote web server. So if we've got existing validation logic, we can execute that. That's the code to actually, I'm whizzing through this because I've literally got 2 minutes left. When the change method's called, we get information back that says, I would like you to display this information into this particular field on the page. We have drill methods, which will go off and call the drill. So we've got buttons on there that allow us to do lookups. And again, if you've done a lookup, it'll call back to do the change method, to do the validation. But I'll just do a very quick 30-second demo. Suppliers. I've got my supplier list. I can select a supplier, and I can see the information, etc. If I make a change, and I go to save it, I've got a bad request. Now actually, because I know what you lot are like, and I was giving you live access to this, I set it up on the server to not authorize anybody to do anything, so I can't actually do anything myself, because I'm not authenticated in this. I've just run it. If I had added authentication, I could do it so I could make the changes, but you lot couldn't. But I wanted to show that, there's authentication that stops you being able to do this on the server. If I create a new one, I've got the red that disappears as I start typing in. If I try and move away, I'll get the dialog that says, you're cancelling, are you sure? Yes, I am, thank you very much. I'm not going to group maintenance because it's very similar, and I've literally gone over 30 seconds, so there you go. This is the part one. I've got the drill here, so I can look up on I'll put, I don't know what it was, so I'll change it to clutch. And AFAM, I'll change it from AFAM to KNN. Okay, no, I won't. Oh, haha. Right, does anybody know why that error happened? Because it's got an and in it, which is on the URL. So that messed up. I need to catch that. So, as I say, you've got drill and change methods and all that kind of good stuff. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is single-page applications. Sorry it was a bit rushed at the end. I obviously took far too much at the beginning.
All right. Thank you, Richard.